Thomas Brennan wiped the sweat from his brow as he stood outside the small chapel, the July heat beating down mercilessly on his shoulders. In less than an hour, he would pledge himself to a woman whose face he could barely recall from their single awkward meeting 2 weeks prior. A woman the town whispered about with equal parts pity and judgment. A woman who wanted this union no more than he did. The sheriff's ultimatum still rang in his ears like a death knell. Find a wife within 30 days or lose custody of your nephew. The boy needs a mother figure, Brennan. The territorial judge won't see it any other way. Behind him, the townspeople gathered with barely concealed excitement. They believed they were witnessing a salvation, a practical solution to 2 separate problems. They had no conception of the resentment brewing in both bride and groom. 3 weeks earlier, Thomas had been working his copper mine when Sheriff Davis rode up with news that changed everything. Your brother and his wife passed from cholera down in Santa Fe. The boy survived. He's on the wagon train heading here now. You're his only living relative. Thomas had stumbled backward, grief hitting him like a physical blow. Michael, his younger brother, dead at 26. And now a 7-year-old nephew he'd met only twice was coming to live with him in a mining camp that was no place for children. The sheriff hadn't given him time to grieve. The territorial judge is particular about these matters. A single man running a dangerous mining operation can't properly raise a child. You'll need a wife, Brennan. The court won't see any other option. Thomas had laughed bitterly. I've been a bachelor for 32 years, Davis. I'm not about to change that now. But the sheriff's response had been as cold as mountain snow. Then you'll watch that boy go to an orphanage back east. Your choice. The town council had acted with terrifying efficiency. Within days, Mrs. Catherine Porter, the mayor's wife, had appeared at his claim with her solution already arranged. Mr. Brennan, I'd like to introduce you to Miss Rebecca Thornton. She's agreed to become your wife. Thomas had looked past the formidable Mrs. Porter to the woman standing stiffly behind her. Rebecca Thornton was 31 years old, which made her practically unmarriageable by any frontier standard. She'd been running the general store for 5 years, ever since arriving from Philadelphia under circumstances no one discussed openly. She was tall and lean, with sharp features that seemed permanently set in disapproval. Her dark hair was pulled back so severely it looked painful, and her gray eyes held a wariness that spoke of past betrayals. The few times Thomas had been in the general store, he'd found her intimidating. She spoke with a clipped Eastern accent, quoted prices with mathematical precision, and had a way of looking at men that made them feel inadequate. She kept books stacked behind the counter and could discuss literature and politics with an education that put most frontier men to shame. The miners' wives respected her competence but found her cold. The men found her unsettling. What Thomas didn't know was that Rebecca had her own desperate reasons for accepting this arrangement. Just days before, the store's owner, Mr. Garrett, had cornered her after closing time with news that shattered her carefully rebuilt world. Miss Thornton, I'm selling the store to my nephew from Denver. He'll be bringing his own wife to run it. I'm afraid your services will no longer be needed. Rebecca had felt the floor drop out from under her. But I've run this store for 5 years. I've increased your profits by 30%. Where am I supposed to go? Garrett had shrugged with practiced indifference. That's hardly my concern. You have until month's end to find other arrangements. Perhaps you should have married when you had the chance. A woman your age, alone, it's not proper. People talk. The cruelty of it had taken her breath away. She'd fled Philadelphia to escape scandal and shame, built a new life through sheer determination and 14-hour workdays, and now it was being ripped away because she lacked a husband. She had no family left back east, no money saved beyond what would get her to the next town, and no prospects anywhere. When Mrs. Porter had approached her the next day with the proposal, Rebecca had swallowed every ounce of her pride and accepted. Marrying a stranger seemed preferable to returning east in disgrace or ending up destitute on the frontier. The meeting Mrs. Porter had arranged between them had been excruciating. Thomas and Rebecca had sat across from each other in the mayor's parlor, supervised by Mrs. Porter like children who couldn't be trusted alone. They'd exchanged perhaps 20 words total, most of them about practical arrangements. Neither had asked the other about hopes, dreams, or feelings. What would have been the point? Now, as the chapel doors swung open, both bride and groom felt the crushing weight of their trapped circumstances. Rebecca walked down the aisle in a borrowed brown dress that had been hastily altered to fit her tall frame, her face composed in an expression of rigid dignity that masked her screaming despair. She looked straight ahead, refusing to meet the pitying or curious stares of the assembled townspeople. She could hear their whispers. Poor thing, finally found someone to take her. He must be desperate. Well, beggars can't be choosers. She's lucky he needs a mother for that boy. Each word was a knife, but she kept her spine straight and her expression neutral. Thomas watched her approach and felt a surge of resentment mixed with reluctant sympathy. They were both prisoners of this town's interference, two proud people being shoved together like puzzle pieces that would never properly fit. He noticed she was trembling slightly despite her composed expression, and felt an unwelcome pang of guilt. She didn't want this any more than he did. Reverend Clark rushed through the ceremony as though he sensed the powder keg atmosphere in the small chapel. His usual flowery language about love and devotion was notably absent, replaced by the bare minimum required by law. Do you, Thomas Brennan, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? Do you, Rebecca Thornton, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? Their responses were barely audible. I do, spoken like confessions extracted under duress. Young Daniel, Thomas's nephew, sat in the front pew beside Mrs. Porter, his 7-year-old face confused and sad. The boy had just lost his parents and now had to watch his uncle marry a complete stranger. Daniel's small suit was still black from mourning, and his eyes were red-rimmed from crying. It was cruel, all of it. When the moment came for Thomas to kiss his bride, he barely touched his lips to her cheek. Rebecca's face flushed with humiliation, and she kept her eyes fixed on the floor. The assembled crowd shifted uncomfortably, sensing the lack of affection but choosing to ignore it. The townspeople erupted in forced celebration, congratulating themselves on their charitable matchmaking while the newlyweds stood frozen in their new reality. Look how well this worked out, Mrs. Porter announced to anyone within earshot. 2 problems solved at once. That's what community does, takes care of its own. The reception in the church hall was an exercise in torture. The town's busybodies praised their own cleverness while Thomas and Rebecca sat at opposite ends of the head table, maintaining a careful silence. People brought gifts they couldn't afford and didn't need, kitchen items and household goods that felt like chains being forged link by link. Perfect arrangement, Mrs. Porter announced loudly, holding court in the center of the room. Mr. Brennan gets help raising Daniel, Miss Thornton gets security, and everyone benefits. It's what civilized people do, help each other in times of need. Thomas's hand tightened around his coffee cup until his knuckles showed white. Everyone benefits. He'd just sold his freedom to keep a nephew he barely knew from being shipped to an orphanage. He'd given up any hope of someday finding what his brother Michael had found, that rare and precious love match that made all the hardship worthwhile. Rebecca sat rigidly in her chair, accepting congratulations with mechanical politeness. Women she'd worked with for 5 years suddenly acted like they were her dearest friends, giving her advice about marriage as though she'd asked for it. Make sure you're patient with the boy. Men don't know how to raise children properly. Keep a clean house and he'll appreciate you. The condescension was suffocating. The ride to his mining claim was conducted in suffocating silence. Daniel sat between them on the wagon seat, occasionally glancing nervously at Rebecca, who kept her hands folded tightly in her lap. Thomas stared straight ahead at the dusty trail winding into the hills, the reins loose in his hands as the horses followed the familiar path home. The landscape was beautiful in its harsh way. Red rock formations jutted from hillsides covered in desert scrub. The late afternoon sun painted everything in shades of copper and gold. In different circumstances, Rebecca might have appreciated the wild beauty of this territory. Instead, she felt like she was riding toward a prison. When they finally arrived at his cabin, Rebecca stepped down from the wagon and surveyed what was now supposedly her home. The structure was sturdy but stark, built for function rather than comfort. It sat on a hillside overlooking the copper mine works, surrounded by the rugged Arizona mountains that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The mine entrance was visible about 100 yards away, timber supports framing the dark opening in the hillside. The cabin itself was larger than she'd expected, built from rough-hewn logs with a covered porch facing west toward the sunset. But there was nothing soft about it, no curtains in the windows, no flowers in the yard, no sign that anyone cared about making it beautiful. It was shelter, nothing more. Thomas carried their bags inside and turned to face his new wife with all the enthusiasm of a man facing a firing squad. Let's be clear about what this is. This marriage is a legal necessity, nothing more. You'll have the back room off the kitchen. I expect you to care for Daniel and keep the household running. Beyond that, we don't need to pretend this is anything other than a business arrangement. His voice was cold, distant, as though they were negotiating a mining contract rather than a marriage. Rebecca felt something inside her wither at the tone, but she refused to show it. Rebecca lifted her chin, her Philadelphia upbringing giving her a dignity that frontier life couldn't strip away. Understood, Mr. Brennan. But I have my own conditions. I'll need access to books and proper supplies for teaching Daniel. I won't be treated like hired help in this house. And if I'm to care for your nephew, I'll do it according to my own methods, not yours. I won't have you undermining me in front of the boy. They stared at each other across the small main room, two stubborn people forced into corners neither had anticipated. The air between them crackled with tension and resentment. Daniel chose that moment to start crying, reaching for Thomas and recoiling from Rebecca as though she were a threat. Stranger, the boy sobbed. I want to go home. I want my mama. Thomas picked up the boy, and Rebecca felt something twist painfully in her chest. Even a child could sense she didn't belong here. Daniel buried his face in Thomas's shoulder, his small body shaking with sobs that broke both adults' hearts. I never wanted this, Thomas said quietly, holding Daniel close and rocking him gently. Rebecca straightened her shoulders and picked up her single traveling case, the one that held everything she owned in the world. Neither did I, Mr. Brennan. But here we are. She walked to her new room, a small space off the kitchen that had apparently been used for storage. It was clean but sparse, with a narrow bed, a small dresser, and a single window that looked out toward the mountains. This was her life now. This was what remained of the dreams she'd once had. Rebecca sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to cry silently. Then she dried her eyes, unpacked her few belongings, and began planning how she would survive this prison of a marriage. Neither of them realized this forced beginning would transform into something neither could have imagined. The first 2 weeks of their marriage felt like an eternity stretched thin. Thomas and Rebecca moved around each other like wary animals, each determined to prove they didn't need the other's presence. The cabin that had seemed spacious suddenly felt suffocatingly small with 3 people trying to avoid each other. Rebecca threw herself into organizing the household with the precision of a military campaign. She cleaned every surface until it gleamed, rearranged cupboards and supplies according to a system that made sense to her ordered mind, and established routines for meals and chores. Everything had its place, its time, its proper method. Thomas responded by silently moving things back to their original places whenever possible, clinging to the familiar arrangements from his bachelor days. The coffee tin belonged on the left side of the shelf, not the right. The lanterns hung by the door, not in the cupboard. The cast iron skillet stayed on the stove, not hung on a wall hook. It was petty and childish, but it was the only control he had left in what had been his home. Their silent war of domestic rearrangement would have been comical if it hadn't been so sad. Rebecca would organize the pantry one way, Thomas would change it back. She'd establish a new location for firewood, he'd move it. Neither spoke about what they were doing, but the message was clear. This is my territory. You're the intruder. Daniel became the unwitting battlefield between them. The boy was grieving his parents and acting out in ways that broke Thomas's heart. He refused to eat the meals Rebecca prepared, pushing away plates and demanding food his mother used to make. He threw tantrums when Rebecca tried to help him dress or wash his face, screaming that she was doing it wrong. He clung to Thomas with desperate intensity whenever his uncle tried to leave for work at the mine, crying as though each departure was another abandonment. Rebecca approached childcare with logic and structure, as she'd approached running the general store. She attempted to establish regular lessons, teaching Daniel his letters and numbers during designated study hours. She insisted on proper meal schedules, 3 times daily whether the boy was hungry or not. She tried to enforce behavioral expectations that made sense to her educated mind but meant nothing to a traumatized 7-year-old who just wanted his mother back. Daniel, you need to eat your vegetables. Daniel, sit up straight at the table. Daniel, we don't cry when we don't get our way. Her tone was patient but firm, the voice of someone managing an employee rather than comforting a grieving child. Daniel responded by digging in his heels and making life difficult for everyone. He spilled things deliberately, spoke rudely when Rebecca tried to teach him, and found 100 small ways to make his rejection clear. He doesn't like me, Rebecca said quietly one evening as Thomas took a sobbing Daniel from her arms after another failed attempt at getting the boy to bed. Her voice was carefully neutral, but Thomas heard the hurt underneath. Thomas rocked his nephew gently, feeling the small body gradually relax against him. He's grieving. Give him time. But they both knew it was more complicated than that. Daniel represented everything they'd each lost. For Thomas, the boy was a living reminder of his brother Michael, of the family connection he'd never properly appreciated until it was gone. For Rebecca, Daniel was a painful symbol of the children she'd never have with a man who actually loved her, the family she'd imagined back in Philadelphia before scandal destroyed everything. Every interaction with the boy was a fresh wound for both of them. The cabin developed invisible boundary lines. Thomas's bedroom was his territory, a place Rebecca never entered. Her small room off the kitchen was hers alone. The main room was neutral ground where they were rigidly polite to each other, saying please and thank you for the smallest things. The porch became Thomas's refuge in the evenings, where he'd sit smoking his pipe and staring at the mountains until full dark. Rebecca developed her own routine. She'd wake before dawn, prepare breakfast mechanically, then spend her days maintaining the household with relentless efficiency. Everything was always clean, organized, and proper. But there was no warmth in it, no sense of home. It was maintenance, duty, survival. Dinner was the worst time. They'd sit at the same table, eating food Rebecca had prepared, maintaining strained conversation about practical matters. The mine's producing well. That's good. I repaired the fence by the well. Thank you. Daniel needs new boots. I'll ride to town next week. Their words were weapons of politeness, keeping each other at a safe distance. At night, Rebecca would lie in her narrow bed and listen to the sounds of the house. Thomas moving around in his room. Daniel occasionally crying out in his sleep. The wind whistling through the mountains. She'd think about Philadelphia, about the life she'd lost, about the fact that she was now trapped in a loveless marriage with no escape. Sometimes she cried silently into her pillow, but only when she was certain no one could hear. Thomas would lie in his own bed, staring at the ceiling and thinking about Michael. His brother had found real love with Daniel's mother Clara. They'd been happy in a way that seemed almost miraculous on the harsh frontier. And now Michael was gone, Clara was gone, and Thomas was stuck in a mockery of marriage to a woman who looked at him like he was a burden she had to bear. The breakthrough came on a sweltering afternoon when Daniel's persistent misbehavior turned into something far more serious. Thomas was working at the mine entrance, checking timber supports, when he heard Rebecca calling his name with an urgency that sent ice through his veins. He dropped his tools and ran, his heart pounding with immediate terror. He found them in Daniel's small room. Rebecca was holding the boy with surprising competence, but Daniel's face was covered in angry red welts, his breathing wheezy and labored. His small hands clawed at his throat as though he couldn't get enough air. "How long has he been like this?" Rebecca asked, her voice steady despite obvious concern. Her usual stern expression had transformed into focused intensity. Thomas's hands trembled as he examined his nephew. "I don't know. He was playing outside an hour ago. He seemed fine." "Oh God, is he dying? Tell me he's not dying." The panic in Thomas's voice was raw, and for a moment Rebecca saw past his cold exterior to the terrified man underneath. Rebecca was already moving, laying Daniel on the bed and examining him with practiced efficiency. Her hands were quick but gentle, checking his breathing, looking at his eyes, examining every welt. "These are bee stings. Multiple ones. Look at his neck and arms. I can see the stingers still embedded. What do we do?" Thomas asked, hearing the panic in his own voice. The nearest doctor was 2 days' ride away in the territorial capital. They were on their own, and his nephew was struggling to breathe. Rebecca's expression was calm and focused in a way that would have surprised Thomas if he hadn't been so frightened. "My mother was a nurse in Philadelphia. I helped her treat patients for years before. She didn't mention the scandal that had forced her west, but she didn't need to. I know what to do, but I need your help. First, we need to remove all the stingers. Then we need to reduce the swelling and watch for any signs of severe reaction." What followed broke down the first barrier between them. Rebecca took charge with quiet authority that impressed Thomas despite his terror. She sent him to fetch cool water from the well and clean cloths from the cupboard while she carefully removed each stinger from Daniel's skin with tweezers, her hands steady despite the boy's whimpers. "I need baking soda from the kitchen. And honey if you have it. Vinegar. And see if there are any onions." Thomas ran to get the items, his mind racing. When he returned, Rebecca was already mixing a paste, her movements confident and precise. She'd clearly done this before, perhaps many times. "Keep talking to him," Rebecca instructed as she began applying the mixture to each welt. Children respond better when they hear familiar voices. It helps them stay calm and fight the reaction. Thomas found himself talking to Daniel in a steady stream, telling stories about his brother Michael, about adventures they'd had as boys exploring these same mountains, about how brave Daniel was being, about how much he loved his nephew. His voice shook but he kept talking, desperate to give the boy something to hold on to. And somewhere in that long, frightening afternoon, he realized Rebecca was talking too, her voice weaving with his in a comforting chorus. She sang songs in what sounded like German, old lullabies her mother had taught her. She told stories about brave young boys who conquered mountains and defeated dragons. She spoke in a voice that trembled with genuine emotion, all her usual stern distance completely gone. "You're doing wonderfully, Daniel," she said softly, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. "The swelling is already going down. You're a very strong boy. Your mother and father would be so proud of you." The mention of his parents made Daniel's eyes fill with tears, but he didn't pull away from her touch. For the first time since arriving, the boy seemed to accept Rebecca's care. Thomas watched her work and truly saw her for the first time. Not the stern shopkeeper or the unwanted wife, but a competent, compassionate woman who was fighting to save his nephew's life. Her hands were gentle despite their efficiency. Her voice was soothing despite her usual sharp tone. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she genuinely cared about the outcome. As evening fell, Daniel's breathing eased and the swelling began to recede. The paste had worked, drawing out the venom and reducing the inflammation. The boy fell into a peaceful sleep, exhausted but clearly recovering. Thomas slumped in his chair, drained but grateful, while Rebecca continued monitoring their patient every few minutes, checking his breathing, feeling his forehead for fever. "He's going to be fine," Rebecca said softly, her shoulders finally relaxing. The stings looked worse than they were. Children usually recover quickly if the reaction isn't severe. "We'll need to watch him through the night, but I believe the danger has passed." "Thank you," Thomas said, and meant it with his whole heart. The words felt inadequate for what she'd just done. "You saved his life." "I didn't even know what to do. I would have panicked and made it worse." Rebecca looked surprised, as if she'd expected him to dismiss her efforts or take credit himself. "Your mother taught you well," he continued. "That was remarkable." She smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her entire face from stern to almost beautiful. "My mother used to say healing wasn't just about medicine. It was about caring enough to fight for someone, even when you're exhausted. Even when you don't know if your efforts will be enough." The words hung between them, heavy with new meaning. They could have been talking about Daniel's bee stings, or they could have been talking about their marriage. Neither was quite ready to name which. Later that evening, after Daniel had eaten a small meal and returned to sleep, Thomas and Rebecca found themselves sharing coffee at the kitchen table and actually talking. Not the stilted, formal exchanges they'd been forcing for weeks, but real conversation about real things. The barriers they'd so carefully constructed were beginning to crack. "I came west because my fiancé in Philadelphia was arrested for fraud," Rebecca admitted, staring into her cup. The coffee was strong and bitter, matching the taste of her memories. He'd been stealing from his employer for years, embezzling money to maintain a lifestyle he couldn't afford. "When they caught him, his family blamed me. Said I'd been his accomplice, that I'd seduced him into crime, that I'd known all along and helped him hide it. None of it was true, but the scandal destroyed everything." She paused, her hands wrapped around the warm cup. "I lost my position as a teacher at a girls' academy. My father stopped speaking to me, said I'd brought shame to our family name. My friends abandoned me overnight. The newspapers ran stories calling me the Scarlet Woman who'd corrupted an upstanding man. Coming west was the only option left. I had just enough money for the journey and nothing else." Thomas studied her face, seeing vulnerability where he'd only seen pride before. "I'm sorry. That's cruel beyond measure." Rebecca shrugged, but her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I told myself I'd never let another man have power over me again. Never trust, never depend, never care too much. And yet here I am, trapped in exactly what I swore I'd avoid. A marriage where I have no power, no choice, no voice." Thomas felt a surge of guilt. He'd been so focused on his own resentment that he hadn't considered what she was giving up. At least he had the mine, had his work, had something that was his. Rebecca had given up everything with no guarantee of anything in return. "I never thought I'd marry either," Thomas confessed. "My brother Michael always said I was too stubborn, too set in my ways, too content being alone. He was probably right. I liked my life the way it was. The mine, the mountains, my freedom. This forced marriage, it goes against everything I believe about how people should choose their lives." He took a long drink of coffee, remembering Michael's wedding to Clara. They'd chosen each other out of love. Their wedding had been filled with joy and hope. His own wedding had been a funeral for both their freedoms. Rebecca nodded slowly. "In Philadelphia, I thought marriage would be about partnership and respect. Two people choosing each other and building something together. Instead, I discovered my fiancé saw me as property, as something to show off to his friends. Coming west, I told myself I'd rather be alone forever than give another man that kind of power over me. And yet here I am." They sat in surprisingly comfortable silence, two people who'd been betrayed by life in different ways but had ended up in the same place. Outside, the desert night had cooled considerably, and stars were appearing in the vast sky like tiny promises. "The mine's not producing as well as it should," Thomas said suddenly, surprising himself with his honesty. He'd told no one about his fears, not even Sheriff Davis. "I've been working a vein that should be rich with copper, but the yields keep dropping. I'm bringing up ore, but when it's smelted, the copper content is lower than it should be. If it doesn't improve soon, I won't be able to afford to keep Daniel even with this marriage satisfying the court." The admission cost him something. Men didn't admit failure or fear, especially not to women. But Rebecca had just saved Daniel's life with skill and compassion he hadn't known she possessed. Maybe she deserved to know the full truth of what she'd gotten herself into. Rebecca set down her coffee cup and looked at him directly. "I managed a store's accounts for 5 years. I'm good with numbers and logistics, better than most men if I'm being honest. Maybe I could look at your operation, see if there's something you're missing." Sometimes a fresh perspective can spot problems the person closest to the situation overlooks. Thomas's pride bristled at the suggestion. His mine, his business, his problem to solve. What could a shopkeeper possibly know about mining operations? But then he remembered how she'd taken charge with Daniel, how calm and capable she'd been when he was falling apart. Maybe she could see something he'd missed. "I suppose it wouldn't hurt to have another set of eyes on the books," he said carefully. Though he wasn't quite ready to admit he might need her help. Rebecca nodded, accepting the grudging olive branch for what it was. A small step towards something that might eventually resemble partnership. The next morning, Rebecca walked the mine site with Thomas, asking questions that revealed her sharp mind. She examined the operation with the same systematic approach she'd used organizing the household, but this time Thomas didn't resist. She noted where ore was piled, how timber supports were arranged, which tools were used for what purpose. By afternoon, she was reviewing his supply records and shipping manifests at the kitchen table, her finger tracing down columns of numbers with practiced precision. "Thomas, these numbers don't make sense," she said, looking up from his ledgers with a frown that made Thomas's stomach clench. "You're being charged twice for the same equipment deliveries. Look here, and here." Thomas leaned over her shoulder to examine the documents, and suddenly they were very close. He caught the scent of her hair, something clean that reminded him of soap and sunshine, completely unlike the perfumes wealthy women wore. It was honest and real, like everything about her was turning out to be. Rebecca felt the warmth of his body near hers and had to force herself to concentrate on the numbers instead of the way her heart had started beating faster. This was business, she reminded herself. Nothing more. "Someone at the mining supply company has been cheating you," Rebecca continued, her voice slightly breathless. "These duplicate charges go back almost a year. You've lost hundreds of dollars, maybe close to 1,000. Thomas straightened up, anger replacing confusion. "Harold Simmons runs that company. He's been supplying miners in this territory for a decade. Everyone uses him." But Rebecca's expression was determined, and Thomas was beginning to recognize that look. It meant she'd found something that offended her sense of right and wrong. "Then he's been stealing from them for a decade. We need to confront him with evidence he can't deny. If we build a strong enough case, he'll have to make restitution or face prosecution." They spent the next 3 days building their case with methodical precision. Thomas found himself watching Rebecca as she worked, amazed by her intelligence and tenacity. She cross-referenced dates with deliveries he remembered receiving. She calculated totals and identified patterns in the fraudulent charges. She built a timeline that would have impressed any Philadelphia lawyer and probably put most frontier lawyers to shame. She worked with a focused intensity that was almost beautiful. Her stern expression softened when she found a particularly egregious example of fraud. Her eyes lit up when she connected 2 pieces of evidence. She was solving a puzzle, and she was brilliant at it. "You should have been running a business," Thomas said during a break, surprising them both with his honesty. "Not just working in someone else's store. You have a mind for this." Rebecca laughed, but there was bitterness in it. "Women don't run businesses, Mr. Brennan. We're allowed to work in them if we're unmarried and desperate enough, but ownership? Real authority? Those are reserved for men. The best I could hope for in Philadelphia was to marry a man who'd let me help behind the scenes and take all the credit for my ideas. Thomas felt a surge of anger at a world that would waste such capability simply because it belonged to a woman. It seemed stupid and short-sighted, like throwing away good tools just because you didn't like their shape. "Well, you're running this investigation," he said. "And you'll get credit for it." Rebecca looked at him with surprise and something that might have been the beginning of respect. The confrontation with Simmons came on a blazing hot morning when the mine supplier was making his weekly rounds through the territory. Thomas and Rebecca met him at the mine entrance with their carefully prepared evidence spread out on a makeshift table. Harold Simmons was a heavy-set man in his 50s who'd grown prosperous supplying the mining camps. He climbed down from his wagon with his usual jovial smile, expecting another routine sale. "Brennan, good to see you. I've got those replacement picks you ordered and some excellent quality rope that just came in from Denver. We need to talk about your billing practices, Harold," Thomas said, his voice hard as the copper ore he mined. Simmons's smile faltered. "My billing practices?" Rebecca stepped forward with their ledgers. "Mr. Simmons, I've reviewed Mr. Brennan's accounts for the past year. You've been charging him for deliveries that were never made. You've invoiced him twice for the same equipment. You've added fees that don't exist in your standard rate schedule. The total amount of fraudulent charges exceeds $900. Simmons tried to bluster and deny, his face reddening. "Now see here, this is just confusion about paperwork. Mining supply is complicated business. A woman wouldn't understand the details." But Rebecca systematically destroyed each of his excuses. She presented duplicate invoices with different dates but identical content. She pointed out equipment Thomas had been charged for but never received, cross-referenced against his own careful records of what he'd actually used. She spoke with the cold precision of someone who'd spent years managing accounts and wouldn't be intimidated by a blustering man trying to cover his theft. When other miners began gathering, drawn by the raised voices and sensing profitable entertainment, Simmons's resistance crumbled. The last thing he needed was word spreading that he was a cheat. "Fine," the supplier finally admitted, his face gray with defeat and shame. "There might have been some errors in my bookkeeping. I'll adjust your account." "Full restitution," Rebecca insisted, her voice allowing no argument. "Every fraudulent charge removed. And a public apology to every miner you've been cheating, because Mr. Brennan wasn't your only victim, was he?" Simmons's silence was answer enough. Several of the gathered miners exchanged glances and Thomas knew they'd be checking their own records soon. When they walked away victorious, Thomas felt like he could breathe properly for the first time in months. The weight that had been crushing him lifted slightly. The mine might actually survive now. That evening, they celebrated with Daniel between them at the dinner table, the boy actually smiling as he watched the two adults laugh together. The tension that had filled the cabin for weeks had transformed into something lighter, something that almost felt like hope. Thomas opened a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving for a special occasion that he'd thought would never come. He poured 2 small glasses, then added a tiny amount of honey to milk for Daniel, letting the boy feel included in the celebration. "To sharp minds and second chances," Thomas toasted, raising his glass. Rebecca lifted hers, and Thomas saw something in her eyes he hadn't seen before. Warmth, genuine pleasure, maybe even the beginning of friendship. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said, surprising them both with her honesty. "In Philadelphia, I would have had to work through a man, let him take all the credit. Or more likely, I wouldn't have been allowed to look at the books at all. Here, we were partners." Thomas looked at her across the table and saw not the stern spinster or unwanted wife, but a remarkable woman who'd just saved his livelihood and possibly his nephew's future. "We make a good team," he said quietly, and the way her face lit up made something shift uncomfortably but not unpleasantly in his chest. For the first time since their forced wedding, neither of them felt quite so trapped. 4 months into their strange marriage, everything had fundamentally changed in ways neither had anticipated. The cabin that had felt like a prison now felt like something approaching a home. Daniel had gradually warmed to Rebecca, starting with small acceptances, letting her help with his boots, listening to her stories without protest, eventually seeking her out when Thomas was working late at the mine. The boy had started calling her Aunt Becca last week, and Rebecca had felt something bloom in her chest that she'd thought long dead. The first time Daniel had run to her with a scraped knee instead of waiting for Thomas, she'd fought back tears while cleaning and bandaging the small wound. The mine was producing better than ever under their joint management. Rebecca had reorganized the entire operation, creating schedules for ore extraction that maximized efficiency and minimized wasted effort. She'd renegotiated supply contracts with honest dealers, tracked every pound of ore from extraction to sale, and instituted a bookkeeping system that would have made any Philadelphia accountant proud. Neighbors who'd initially gossiped about the arranged marriage now spoke admiringly of how well they worked together. "Did you see how she handled Simmons? Not many women could stand up to a man like that. And Brennan, he actually listens to her. Treats her like she has sense. It's unusual but it works." But it was the small moments that revealed the deepest transformations. The way Thomas found himself hurrying home from the mine each evening, looking forward to Rebecca's sharp wit and surprisingly warm humor. The way Rebecca caught herself humming while cooking, something she hadn't done since before her world fell apart in Philadelphia. The way they both found excuses to work together on household projects, their conversations stretching longer and ranging farther from practical matters to dreams and fears and the thousand small thoughts that made up a life. They'd started eating meals together as a family, with Daniel chattering about his day between them. The boy would tell elaborate stories about the lizards he'd caught or the rocks he'd found, and both adults would listen with genuine interest. Sometimes Rebecca would correct his grammar gently, and Daniel would accept it without resentment. Sometimes Thomas would add details about mining or animals, turning every conversation into a lesson without making it feel like schoolwork. The invisible boundary lines in the cabin had dissolved. Rebecca now entered Thomas's room to put away his clean laundry. Thomas would sometimes sit at the kitchen table in her domain, drinking coffee and talking while she worked. The rigid politeness had transformed into easy companionship. One evening, as they sat reviewing plans for expanding the mine's operations, their hands touched over the same document. Neither pulled away immediately. For a heartbeat that lasted forever, they looked at each other and saw something that had nothing to do with business arrangements or forced marriages. Thomas felt his heart racing like a schoolboy's while Rebecca's carefully maintained walls began crumbling. His hand was warm and calloused against hers, strong from years of mining work. She could feel his pulse through his fingertips, could see the way his eyes had darkened slightly. "Sorry," Thomas said, pulling his hand back, though he didn't sound sorry at all. Rebecca nodded, unable to form words. She looked back down at the document, but the numbers swam before her eyes. What was happening between them? When had the stranger she'd married become someone whose touch made her heart race? The town's summer festival was their first public appearance as what looked like a real couple, and Thomas found himself surprisingly nervous as he helped Rebecca down from the wagon. She'd made herself a new dress in deep green that brought out the warmth in her gray eyes, and with her hair softened around her face instead of pulled back severely, she looked nothing like the severe woman he'd married months ago. She looked beautiful, and Thomas realized with a start that he wanted other men to see that she was his wife. Not his business arrangement, not his legal necessity, but his wife. Other men noticed too, and Thomas felt an unexpected spike of possessiveness when Sam Peters, one of the other miners, asked her to dance. Rebecca glanced at Thomas as though asking permission, and he nodded curtly, trying to ignore the jealousy coiling in his gut. "She cleans up well," Sheriff Davis commented, watching Rebecca move gracefully across the dance floor with Peters. "Never would have guessed she could look like that." "You're a lucky man, Brennan." Thomas nodded, surprised by how proud he felt. "She's always been impressive. I was just too stubborn to see it." When they danced together later, her hand in his felt natural, right in a way that both thrilled and terrified him. She fit against him perfectly, her head coming just to his shoulder. He could smell her hair, feel the warmth of her body, sense her heart beating in time with the music. "We're getting good at this," she murmured, close enough that he could feel her breath on his neck. "At what?" he asked, though his voice came out rougher than he'd intended. "Pretending we chose each other," she said. But her smile suggested maybe they weren't pretending anymore. Maybe somewhere along the way, between fighting over coffee tin placement and confronting fraudulent suppliers and caring for a grieving boy, they'd actually chosen each other. Thomas wanted to say something, to tell her what he was feeling, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he just held her closer as they danced, and let himself imagine this was real. The evening shattered when they returned home to find Daniel screaming from a nightmare, thrashing in his bed and calling for his parents. Thomas rushed to comfort him, but the boy was lost in his dream, reliving the moment he'd learned his mother and father were dead. "Mama," Daniel sobbed, reaching toward the ceiling as though trying to grasp something just beyond reach. "Papa, don't go. Please don't leave me." Thomas tried to hold him, but Daniel pushed him away in his confusion, too lost in grief to recognize his uncle. The boy's anguish was heartbreaking, a reminder that beneath the healing, the wound remained. Rebecca stood in the doorway watching, tears streaming down her face. She'd been fooling herself, thinking she could be what this child needed. "I'm not his mother," she whispered, her voice cracking. "She never will. I'm just the woman you were forced to marry, not her real mother. Not anyone's real mother." Thomas had never seen her vulnerable like this, her Philadelphia composure crumbling completely. All her strength and competence couldn't protect her from this pain. "I don't know how to be what he needs," Rebecca continued, her voice breaking. "I don't know how to replace what he lost. I thought if I was patient enough, kind enough, eventually he'd forget. But he won't forget. He shouldn't forget. They were his parents and I'm just nothing." She turned to leave, but Thomas caught her hand, his grip gentle but firm. "Daniel's not the only one who lost something. You lost the life you planned, the man you loved, the family you thought you'd have. But you've given us more than you realize." He guided her to sit beside Daniel's bed, keeping his hand on hers. "Tell him about the mountain spirits. That story you made up about the brave explorers. He always calms down when you tell it." Rebecca's voice shook as she began the gentle tale she'd invented about brave young explorers who climbed mountains to talk with spirits who could answer any question. She'd made it up one night when Daniel couldn't sleep, and it had become his favorite story. "The mountain spirits told the boy that his parents watched over him from the stars," she said softly. "That love never really dies, it just changes form. That everyone who loves us becomes part of who we are, and we carry them with us always." Gradually, Daniel's sobs quieted. The boy's eyes opened, still wet with tears but focusing on Rebecca's face. "You're here," he said, as though surprised. "I'm here," Rebecca confirmed. "Uncle Thomas is here. We're both here, and we're not going anywhere. Do you promise?" Daniel asked, his voice small and scared. Rebecca looked at Thomas, and something passed between them. A decision being made without words. "I promise," she said firmly. "We both promise." As Daniel fell asleep between them, Thomas and Rebecca found themselves really looking at each other for the first time. Really seeing each other, not as the people they'd been forced to become, but as the people they were choosing to be. "This wasn't supposed to happen," Rebecca said quietly once Daniel's breathing had steadied into sleep. "What wasn't?" Thomas asked, though he knew exactly what she meant. "This feeling. Caring about you both so much it terrifies me." Her honesty hit him like a physical blow because he'd been fighting the same impossible truth. "I told myself it was just gratitude at first. You needed help, I could provide it. But it's more than that now." She looked down at Daniel sleeping peacefully between them. I love this boy like he's mine. I didn't think I could love someone else's child, but I do. And you?" She met Thomas's eyes directly. "You're not just my husband on paper anymore." Thomas reached out tentatively, touching her cheek where tears had dried, leaving faint tracks on her skin. "I told myself it was just gratitude too," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "You saved Daniel. You saved the mine. You saved my whole life. But it's more than that now." He traced the line of her jaw with his thumb, marveling at how soft her skin was despite the frontier hardships. "I've fallen in love with my own wife, and I don't know what to do about it." The confession hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they dared cross. Everything could change right now. Everything could shatter. They could lose this fragile thing they'd built. Rebecca leaned into his touch, closing her eyes as years of loneliness and fear cracked open in her chest. "In Boston, I thought I knew what love was. It was flowers and poetry and pretty promises that meant nothing. This is different. This is choosing each other every day, even when it's hard. This is partnership and respect and—" She opened her eyes and met his gaze directly. "This is real." The kiss that followed was gentle, tentative, nothing like the brief, humiliating peck at their wedding altar. This was a question and an answer, a promise and a prayer. Thomas's hand cupped her face while her fingers curled into his shirt, both of them leaning across the sleeping child between them. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Rebecca laughed softly. "We just kissed over your nephew like awkward children." Thomas grinned, an expression Rebecca had rarely seen on his usually serious face. "I don't care. I've been wanting to do that for weeks." "Weeks?" Rebecca's eyebrows rose. "Not months?" "Maybe months," Thomas admitted. "I stopped counting when I realized I looked forward to seeing you more than anything else in my day." They stayed there, sitting on opposite sides of Daniel's bed, holding hands across the sleeping boy and talking quietly until dawn. They talked about everything they'd been afraid to say. About fear and hope and the strange way their forced marriage had transformed into something neither had anticipated. "What happens now?" Rebecca asked as early light began filtering through the window. Thomas looked down at Daniel, still sleeping peacefully between them, then back at his wife's face. "Now we stop pretending this is just an arrangement. Now we choose each other for real this time." The smile that bloomed across Rebecca's face was brighter than the rising sun, and Thomas knew their real story was just beginning. 5 weeks after their first real kiss, Thomas surprised Rebecca by proposing again. This time with his mother's ring that he'd kept hidden for years in the back of a drawer, and words that came from his heart instead of legal obligation. They held their own private ceremony on the hillside overlooking the mine, with Daniel as their witness and a sunset painting the Arizona mountains in shades of copper and gold. "Rebecca Thornton," Thomas said, taking her hand while Daniel stood beside them trying to look serious. "The first time I married you, I did it because I had no choice. Today, I'm asking you to marry me because you're the choice I want to make every day for the rest of my life. Will you truly be my wife?" Rebecca's eyes filled with tears, but they were happy tears this time. "Yes. I choose you too, Thomas Brennan. Every day, for the rest of my life." Thomas slipped his mother's ring onto her finger, and this time when he kissed her, there was nothing hesitant about it. Daniel cheered and clapped, delighted to be part of the ceremony. "This time it's our choice," Thomas said as he pulled back, his forehead resting against hers. "Our choice," Rebecca agreed, and felt a happiness she'd never thought possible. Their happiness lasted exactly 4 days before Thomas's former business partner appeared with a lawyer and a legal claim that threatened everything they'd built. James Whitmore had invested in the mine startup 2 years earlier, then disappeared to California to chase gold strikes. Now he was back, demanding half the mine's profits based on their original agreement. "You can't do this," Thomas said, reading the legal documents with growing horror. "You abandoned your share. I bought you out fair and square. You signed the papers. But Whitmore's lawyer, a slick man from Denver with expensive clothes and a condescending manner, was smooth and confident. My client temporarily relocated for personal reasons and business opportunities. The buyout agreement was signed under duress when Mr. Whitmore needed immediate capital. Such agreements can be challenged in territorial court. Mr. Whitmore is entitled to his original 50% stake, plus back profits from the past 2 years. The amount Whitmore was claiming would bankrupt them. Everything they'd worked for, everything Rebecca had helped build, would be ripped away by legal technicalities and a greedy man who'd contributed nothing to the mine's current success. The case went before the territorial judge in the county seat, requiring a 2-day journey and leaving the mine unattended. Thomas watched his hard-won prosperity threatened by legal maneuvering and Whitmore's expensive attorney. He felt helpless, outmatched by men who understood the law better than he did. But Rebecca refused to give up. She spent days reviewing the original partnership documents, tracking down witnesses who remembered Whitmore's departure, and building their defense with the same methodical precision she'd used against Simmons. "I need to speak at the hearing," Rebecca told Thomas the night before they were due in court. "I know the documents better than anyone, and I can present the evidence clearly." Thomas hesitated. Women rarely spoke in territorial courts. Judges didn't like it, and it could prejudice their case. But he'd learned to trust Rebecca's judgment. "If you think it's right, then you should do it." The courtroom was packed with miners and townspeople who'd come to see the outcome. Judge Harrison was a stern man in his 60s, known for being fair but traditional. He frowned when Rebecca stood to speak, but he didn't stop her. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady and clear despite the hostile stares from some in the courtroom. "I've reviewed every document related to this partnership. Mr. Whitmore didn't abandon his stake temporarily. He sold it legally and accepted payment in full. Here are the bank records showing the transfer of funds. Here are signed receipts acknowledging payment. Here are letters from Mr. Whitmore himself stating he was pursuing other opportunities in California and had no intention of returning to Arizona territory." She presented each piece of evidence methodically, building her case like stacking stones into a wall. Her years managing store accounts had taught her to organize information clearly. Her months helping Thomas had taught her how mining partnerships worked. "Mr. Whitmore made his choice 2 years ago when gold fever took him west," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "He sold his partnership for fair market value at the time. He has no right to claim the fruits of my husband's labor simply because the mine is now profitable. That's not how the law works, and it's not how justice works." She spoke with the precision of a lawyer and the passion of a woman defending her family. The courtroom was silent, everyone riveted by this unexpected spectacle of a woman arguing law before a judge. "If the court allows this claim," Rebecca said in conclusion, "it sets a dangerous precedent. Any man who sells a struggling business could return years later to demand profits once others have made it successful. That's not justice, Your Honor. That's legalized theft." The judge's ruling came after 2 tense days of deliberation. Thomas and Rebecca waited in their hotel room, neither sleeping, both preparing for the worst. When they returned to court, Judge Harrison looked tired but resolute. "The evidence clearly shows that Mr. Whitmore voluntarily sold his partnership stake and received fair compensation at the time. His claim to current profits is denied. Furthermore, the court finds that this lawsuit was filed in bad faith to extort money from a legitimately owned business. Mr. Whitmore is ordered to pay Mr. Brennan's legal costs." Thomas felt like he could breathe again. Rebecca's hand found his under the table and squeezed tight. They'd won. They'd fought together and won. That night, holding Rebecca in their shared bedroom for the first time as a real married couple, Thomas finally understood what they'd built together. "They tried to prove our marriage was just a business arrangement," he murmured against her hair. "Instead, they proved it's the realest thing in this whole territory." Rebecca smiled in the darkness, her head on his chest where she could hear his heartbeat. "We're not the same people who stood at that altar 6 months ago." "No," Thomas agreed, his arms tightening around her. We're better. We chose each other, and that makes us stronger than any marriage that started with love but never had to fight for it. 1 year after their forced wedding, Thomas Brennan stood on his porch watching his wife teach their nephew to identify the constellations in the vast Arizona sky, and he could barely remember the man he'd been before Rebecca came into his life. The mine that had been struggling was now one of the most productive copper operations in the territory. They'd expanded into new veins, hired 2 additional miners, and established contracts with smelters as far away as Denver. The cabin that had been a bachelor's shelter was now a real home, expanded with 2 additional rooms and furnished with items Rebecca had carefully chosen on trips to town. Rebecca was 4 months pregnant now, her body showing the early signs of the child they'd created together, and the sight of her never failed to take his breath away. She'd softened in countless small ways, wearing her hair down in the evenings, choosing dresses in colors that flattered her instead of just serviceable browns and grays, laughing freely at Daniel's jokes and Thomas's teasing. But the biggest change wasn't external. It was in how she carried herself, with the confident grace of a woman who knew she was loved for exactly who she was. No more defensiveness, no more walls. Just Rebecca, brilliant and kind and entirely herself. "Uncle Thomas, look," Daniel called out, now 8 years old and thriving in ways that seemed miraculous compared to the grieving child who'd arrived a year ago. "Aunt Becca says that's Orion's belt. The hunter's belt." Rebecca smiled at the boy's excitement, her hand resting on her belly. "That's right. And those 3 bright stars help travelers find their way. Many cultures have stories about Orion. Just like we found our way to being a real family," Thomas thought, watching them together. The transformation in Daniel was perhaps most remarkable. The traumatized boy who'd rejected Rebecca initially was now a confident child who ran to her with equal enthusiasm as he showed Thomas. He'd started calling her Mama Becca just last month, and when Rebecca had cried happy tears, Daniel had hugged her fiercely and said, "You're my mama now. The one I needed." The schoolhouse had been Rebecca's idea, born from teaching Daniel and realizing how many mining families had children with no access to education. "These children deserve the same opportunities as any Eastern students," she'd told Thomas one evening. "They're just as bright, just as capable. They shouldn't be limited by where they were born." With the mine's profits, they'd built a small schoolhouse near the claim, a sturdy structure with real desks and a chalkboard Rebecca had ordered from Philadelphia. She taught not just Daniel but 15 other children from surrounding areas, everything from reading and arithmetic to history and science. Parents rode from miles away to bring their children to learn from the educated woman from Philadelphia, and Rebecca had found a way to use her abilities to serve rather than feeling trapped by circumstances. She'd become essential to the community in a way that had nothing to do with being Thomas Brennan's wife and everything to do with being Rebecca herself. The town's attitude toward their marriage had completely shifted. What had started as a desperate arrangement orchestrated by Mrs. Porter was now held up as a great success story. Mrs. Porter took full credit, naturally, telling everyone she'd known all along they were perfect for each other and that she had an eye for these things. "Some people just need a little push to find their destiny," Mrs. Porter would say with a satisfied smile, conveniently forgetting how reluctant both bride and groom had been at the altar. But it was the quiet moments that meant the most to Thomas and Rebecca. The early mornings when they'd share coffee on the porch before the day began, talking about their plans and dreams. The evenings when they'd sit together reviewing the mine's books or discussing what Daniel had learned that day. The nights when they'd lie in bed talking about everything and nothing, just enjoying each other's presence. Their physical relationship had blossomed into something powerful and tender. Thomas marveled at how different this felt from anything he'd imagined marriage could be. It was built on respect and shared struggles rather than easy compatibility. They'd earned each other through hardship, disappointment, and gradual trust. That made every moment precious, every touch meaningful. Rebecca often thought about her former fiancé in Philadelphia, the man she'd thought she loved. That relationship had been all surface, pretty words covering selfish intentions. What she had with Thomas was the opposite. It had started ugly and forced, but underneath had been the foundation for something real. Partnership, respect, genuine caring. That's what love actually was. The territorial governor's visit was approaching, and Thomas and Rebecca had been asked to host a dinner at their home, recognition of their status as one of the area's leading families. As they planned the evening, Rebecca laughed about her nervousness during their first social appearance as a couple. "I was so afraid everyone would see we didn't choose each other," she admitted, arranging wildflowers in a vase for the table. "That they'd know it was all fake." Thomas pulled her close, careful of her growing belly. "Let them see everything now. Let them see how ridiculously happy we are. Let them see that sometimes the best things in life are the ones we never planned." The evening of the dinner was perfect. The summer heat had broken, leaving cool air that smelled of sage and copper. The sunset painted the mountains in spectacular shades that made their guests exclaim at the beauty of the territory. Thomas watched Rebecca move among their guests with natural grace, discussing education with the governor's wife, debating territorial politics with local officials, keeping an eye on Daniel as he played with other children. She belonged here in a way she'd never belonged in Philadelphia's rigid society. She'd found her place, her people, her purpose. And Thomas had found his partner, his love, his home. As the evening wound down and their guests departed with warm thanks and promises to visit again, Thomas found himself alone with his family on their porch. Daniel had fallen asleep against Rebecca's side, worn out from excitement. The baby kicked strongly enough that Thomas could see the movement through Rebecca's dress, eager to join their family. "Do you ever think about that day?" Rebecca asked softly, looking up at the stars they'd just been teaching Daniel about. "Our wedding day?" Thomas considered the question seriously, remembering the anger and resentment he'd felt standing outside that chapel. "I think about how trapped I felt, how sure I was that my life was over." He paused, smoothing Daniel's hair gently. "I was such a fool. My life wasn't ending. It was finally beginning." Rebecca smiled, the radiant expression that lit up his entire world. "The town forced us to that altar, but everything after, that was our choice. Every day we chose to try. Every day we chose to care. Every day we chose each other. Every day I chose you," Thomas said, pulling her closer with his free arm. "Every day for the rest of our lives." He looked out over their thriving mine, their expanded home, their sleeping nephew, his pregnant wife, and felt overwhelming gratitude. Not for the town's interference, exactly, but for what that interference had made possible. For the chance to know this remarkable woman. For the family they'd built from absolutely nothing. Years later, when people told the story of Thomas Brennan and the Philadelphia woman he'd been forced to marry, they always ended the same way. She was supposed to be just a convenient solution, but she ended up being everything he never knew he needed. And Thomas would smile because it was absolutely true. Rebecca Thornton had come to Arizona Territory as society's discard, the scandalous woman nobody wanted. But she'd become the cornerstone of not just his family but their entire community. The schoolhouse bore her name now. Young women sought her advice. Miners' wives asked her to review their household accounts. She was respected, valued, essential. As they sat on their porch that night under the vast Arizona sky, Thomas realized that the greatest transformations often begin with the word no. He'd said no to marriage, no to trusting someone with his heart, no to believing he deserved happiness after losing his brother. Rebecca had said no to settling, no to being defined by scandal, no to believing her life was over at 31. But sometimes the most important no is just the beginning of the most beautiful yes. And their yes to each other, to their growing family, to the love they'd built from nothing but resentment and necessity, was a story worth telling for generations to come. Their daughter was born in October, delivered by Rebecca's own hands with Thomas's help since the doctor couldn't arrive in time. They named her Clara Michael, for both of Daniel's parents, and when Daniel held his new sister for the first time, he declared her perfect. As Thomas watched his wife nursing their daughter while their nephew dozed beside them, he thought about all the paths his life could have taken. He could have refused the marriage and lost Daniel to an orphanage. He could have married Rebecca but kept her at a distance, maintaining their arrangement as purely business. He could have let his pride prevent him from seeing her value. Instead, he'd been given the greatest gift of his life, even if he'd been too stubborn to recognize it at first. He'd been given Rebecca. Sharp-minded, strong-willed, tender-hearted Rebecca, who'd saved his mind, raised his nephew, and taught him what love actually meant. And she'd been given him stubborn, proud Thomas, who'd learned to listen, learned to value her mind as much as her care, learned to be a true partner instead of just a husband on paper. Neither of them would ever say they were grateful for being forced into marriage. The loss of choice, the humiliation, the resentment, those were real and had caused genuine pain. But they could say they were grateful for what they'd chosen to build from that forced beginning. Some love stories start with a glance across a crowded room. Some start with years of friendship blooming into more. Theirs had started with anger and desperation and two people who wanted nothing to do with each other. But it had become something beautiful anyway. Something real. Something worth fighting for. And that, Thomas thought as he joined his family on the bed, carefully settling beside Rebecca so he could touch his daughter's tiny hand, made it the best love story of all.